Hi, Steve here, the Laughing Stoic. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'd like to talk about a couple of controversies perhaps in Stoicism, just to sort of outline where things sort of begin and end and how they might be approached. So Stoicism obviously is not a philosophy that covers all of your life generally, although some people have at times advocated that this is a reasonable course of action. But I think most people who approach Stoicism aren't looking for a sort of a one-size-fits-all total life of philosophy. So there's a couple of things that come up from that and how we might look at some of those things from a perspective of Stoicism being somewhat limited in its utility. So first off, I'd like to talk about the dichotomy of control. So dichotomy of control is this idea where you control your actions and the rest of the world does its thing, being some of those things being other people's actions and some just being nature taking its course. So there is a criticism that in fact the nature of people's operation in the world is not restricted to things they control and things they don't control, but rather there are influences, so sort of you might call them partial control. So you might, for example, want to hit a nail into a piece of wood. And if you're young and enthusiastic, even though you're trying very hard to hit that nail on the head, you might miss and damage the wood and damage your goods. That's not your intention, and you weren't completely in control of that, but you'd have some influence on where the hammer went, and if you'd been a bit more careful perhaps, someone might say to you, then you wouldn't have damaged the wood, which would be much better. There are similar other influences you might have on other people or situations, people around you who you could say or not say certain things to, with more or less sort of emotional content, and that might influence them in their course of actions, and that might be actually a good thing, but you might not actually control their actions. That you might have sort of 20 or 30% influence, more or less, but you can only do what you can. So, and then there are other things where you have relatively little influence at all, although people might say you do have a lot of influence, say voting in a country of several million people. With electoral systems, perhaps including first past the post system, you have relatively little chance of altering the course of the election, and whatever influence you have is greatly restricted, not just in the numbers but the way the voting's decided already by a number of fixed camps. It doesn't really matter whether you change your vote if most other people aren't going to. It's not going to have any influence. And then there's other people influencing you as well, in the same way that I described you influencing perhaps your friends or other people, or there are people who can influence you and say and do things that might alter your course of action or your way of thinking about things. So this is a sort of grey zone in the nice black and white dichotomy of control world. But I would suggest that it doesn't really alter the dichotomy of control concept very much at all. In fact, what it does is it turns it into a percentages game. So when you decide to act or not in a certain manner, you are simply deciding how much it's worth influencing this outcome. Say there's someone on the other side of the road on a zebra crossing and they've got earbuds in and they're not paying attention and they're just walking straight out, assuming that zebra crossing is a safe place. All you can see is a big truck bearing down on them and they probably should stop and turn back. So you're going to yell like hell at them, hopefully get through their earbuds and jump in it, wave your arms around. You probably can't get to the other side of the road without being influenced by the truck yourself, but you're going to do some stuff that you hope will influence their actions. And you might try very, very hard, given the serious nature of the consequences of their actions, but you still just do what you can. Ultimately, what happens out there is up to their nature, how loud they're playing their music, whether the truck can stop. You can only do your bit. And really, that is entirely consistent with Stoicism. The fact that it's a numbers game as to what the result is, it's not really about the control of other things, it's about the control of your own actions, attempting to achieve something in the outside world, not the achievement itself. And similarly, influences on you. Perhaps one of the reasons I regularly say that Stoicism's not a philosophy for children is you don't really want children getting too much in the dichotomy of control. You really want to have an influence on your children with some degree of respect for their independence, but also respect for the fact that they can't be fully independent. So, that is an area where I don't think Stoicism really applies, especially to very young children. It's a philosophy largely for adults, and it probably doesn't apply equally well at the other end of the life spectrum if someone's perhaps got a dementia and not able to care for themselves. So my view would be that questions about influence, questioning the idea of dichotomy of control, is somewhat misleading. And if you think it through in terms of still controlling your own actions, being able to direct your own thoughts with temperance, wisdom, justice, and courage, then you can still operate with an entirely Stoic framework in an area which you have influence. And certainly in the Roman world, Stoics were, publicly active, speaking out for justice and progress and rights. And that wasn't them controlling Rome, that was them advocating for things. So I think it's a misdirection to suggest that influence, this grey zone, alters the fundamentals of Stoicism. Another area I might like to talk about is attachments. So Stoics are famous, especially the ancient Greek ones, for suggesting you should be less attached to things in the outside world. Now they begin this with, property and goods and money. Not cars, obviously they didn't have cars back then, but we get very attached to our cars and saying, look, these are just stuff out there that ultimately doesn't have a bearing on who you are or the merits of what you've done with your life. And one of the very famous Stoics was lost his entire life's worth in a boating problem. He's a merchant, all his goods in the boat were lost. He just got by with the skin of his teeth onto the shore, and he gave up mercantile activities and took up Stoicism. Now, many of these ancient Greek Stoics who are aiming for this sort of calmness with little blips of interest in their lives are single. So they're living a kind of a monastic life. So not only do they not have much in the way of attachments in terms of material goods, they're relatively low on attachments in terms of family, offspring, I guess cousins and other people. They keep a company of philosophers and they talk to the public, but they are kind of monastic in their lifestyle. And this is a lifestyle that's adopted in a number of other religions which have similarities to Stoicism, particularly Buddhism, where monks advocate a withdrawal from family life and a preference for a monastic life dedicated to philosophy. Buddhism is kind of a philosophy. So this sounds like a good idea, but it's really restricted to people who particularly want to pursue that, and it has particular merits for them. Certainly by Roman times, most people who consider themselves Stoic had families, and Marcus Aurelius and Seneca would be two famous examples. And, they had attachments, they had spouses, they had children, they looked after, tried to raise as best as possible, and other attachments in their lives. They saw, Seneca talked about, seeking out good company, having, you could be judged by the quality of friends. So attachments are not alien to Stoicism, and I have kind of but Stoicism kind of encourages you to think just how important these things are to you and how costly it will be if these things are lost and you have a kind of an unnecessary attachment. So it does invite you to consider that any person you know could die unexpectedly, and this was a little bit more common in Roman times, but even today people die. In fact, pretty much everybody's going to die, and some people die unexpectedly. So being prepared for that, really, I think the message of Stoicism around this attachment thing is to make the most of the time you have with the people, knowing that it might be truncated. Certainly your own life might end as well. And so that's the focus on the present and not looking for attachments to meet your needs necessarily on an ongoing basis. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is kind of the sort of idea of the citadel, that perhaps we live our lives in a green and pleasant valley dotted with farm buildings, orchards, fields and cattle and such, and life is rich and pleasant, and we enjoy the company of others, and perhaps this was a long time ago, and over the top of the hill comes the Mongol hordes who are wanting to have a picnic on your lawn, and that is a very bad thing, obviously, and everyone wants to retreat to the citadel, the castle, and certainly under those circumstances, you've got to be, very tough about the decisions you made. And kind of the ultimate of that in that metaphor is that, sometimes when the Mongol hordes are coming, you adopt what's called a scorched earth policy, and you destroy, your buildings, your stores of grain, other than you can take into your citadel, your fields, you kill the animals, you poison the wells, you make it discouraging for the Mongols to picnic in that area and hope they'll move on and that you have enough supplies with your friends in the castle and family in the castle. So that's kind of looking at Stoicism as this place that you move to when things get difficult, rather than saying, well, you just live in a citadel the whole time and it doesn't really matter what happens outside of it, which would be an extreme view to take. And I think most people who look at Stoicism are looking at it as a kind of a refuge when time gets difficult, a very structured way of approaching things which clarifies your thought when times are difficult and allows you to persist against very, very high levels of difficulty, which I think is correct and probably the best way to take it. But you should, once the Mongols have gone away, come out of your citadel, re-establish your orchards, breed some new cattle and till and seed your fields, because that's really the way that you want to live. Stoicism, the things about that are, I would say, is that if you look at a Stoic framework, is to maintain the virtue ethic wherever you are in this metaphor, wherever you are in your life. It's important to maintain the courage, temperance, justice and wisdom framework, because that really gives you access to the citadel with kind of a clear mind or a clear conscience, and allows you to make decisions which you can feel calm about later on. Because if you've acted moderately and unjustly in the world, and then you kind of get stuck in a citadel and you've perhaps abandoned people out there in an unjust manner to the Mongols' intentions, you're not going to be able to feel good about yourself. So you do need to maintain the virtue ethic framework all the time. And the dichotomy of control comes into play some of the time, but not all the time. I think there are relationships and activities in which the dichotomy of control does not apply. We've talked about flow, and I've talked about relationships where dichotomy of control is not quite what you want to be doing all the time. But that allows you access to the citadel and have a calm mind and be sure that you've acted properly before having to retreat. So those are my thoughts about those two examples of topics in Stoicism which perhaps are a little controversial. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe, and we'll see you in a week or two. Cheers.